Today we're going to be talking with Mr. Rick Berry, who was a pilot, a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. But before we get started, I'd just like to thank the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and their executive director, Ms. Jen Carlson, for their continued support and all of our free programming that we offer here at the museum. Not only our curator conversations, but also our movie nights and our trivia nights and all the other virtual programming that is coming forward from the museum. You can find all that information on the museum website on our events page. But once again, thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in this free programming. Today, we are pleased to have Mr. Rick Berry here with us today. Is going to be speaking about his time in Vietnam as an Army aviator, a helicopter aviator. Rick grew up in Connecticut, but now calls Madison home after living here for 25 years. After high school and attending the University of Connecticut for a few years, he enlisted in the U.S. Army's helicopter flight school and served as an Army aviator. Rick then returned to the University of Connecticut, where he completed a degree in biology and went on to earn a graduate degree in zoology. He retired after a fun career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, serving as a wildlife biologist and a National Wildlife Refuge Manager. And Rick has been extremely active here at the museum for about 15 years. He's one of our favorite docents downstairs, but he also supports us a lot through other programs and other features and aspects of the museum. And so we are very fortunate to have Mr. Rick Berry here today. Rick, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Hello, everyone. Let's get started here. The Vietnam War is often referred to as the chopper war, the helicopter war, with good reason. About 40,000 U.S. helicopter pilots logged flight time Southeast Asia during the war. A large portion of that number were young Army warrant officers serving at their first duty station after completing flight school. Warrant officer pilots were relatively young because most of them, including me, took advantage of an Army program which allowed a guy to enlist for flight school. You could do that right out of high school. You would enlist for the Army's Warrant Officer Rotary Wing Aviator course. It took about a year to complete basic training and flight school. Most new pilots received orders for an aviation unit in Vietnam as their first duty station after flight school. Next. Okay, the blue triangle on the door of this cartoon helicopter is the emblem used to identify A Company helicopters. We're going to see that blue triangle numerous times as I go forward. Next. I joined A Company at a base camp called Landing Zone English. The term landing zone or LZ refers to a helicopter landing area that could range in size from a hole in the jungle, barely large enough to accommodate one aircraft, to a large base camp like LZ English. LZ English was located in the coastal plain of the Central Highlands. The coastal plain is a relatively narrow strip of land right along the coast, mostly flat, intensely farmed. Most of the Vietnamese population in the Central Highlands lived in the coastal plain rather than the much wider upland area to the west. Next. The 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam was the Army's first airmobile division, meaning that the field operation used helicopters and airmobile assault tactics to rapidly move light infantry around the battlefield, and then used helicopters again for all the logistics necessary to maintain the field. The 1st Cav was a self-reliant combined arms outfit. So the infantry were 1st Cav, the assault helicopters were 1st Cav, the artillery was 1st Cav, close air support in the form of helicopter gunships was also 1st Cav, and we'll soon see it took all 4 of those components to carry out an airmobile assault, which we simply refer to as a combat assault. Next. This slide shows a portion of the coastal plain on a hazy day. We will revisit this area. It's called the plain, and the mouth of this river later on a captured North Vietnamese. Is that a sharp troop or what? The gun belt I'm wearing, which we can just about see here, was not Army issue, but was quite functional. Helicopter crew members wore a chest protector we called a chicken plate. It weighed about 20 pounds and would stop a rifle bullet, but was not comfortable to wear with the shoulder holsters we were issued for our revolvers. So a number of us wore the gun belts. Next. Okay, I was standing next to the left cockpit door of one of these helicopters. Notice the blue triangle on the door. This is an A Company aircraft over the coastal plain. The official name for this aircraft was a UH-1H Iroquois. It is way better known as a Huey. This troop and cargo carrying version of the Huey was also called a slick, crew of 4, 2 pilots, 2 door gunners. In our company, the aircraft commander flew the left seat. He was responsible for the operation of the aircraft no matter who was flying. Aircraft commanders also functioned as combat instructor pilots for the new guys joining our company from flight school. New pilots learn quickly, however, because we flew often. Using my flight records as an example, I logged my first flight time in Vietnam on May 11, 1967. During the rest of May and the month of June, a 50-day period, I logged 229 hours of flight time. The Hueys I flew in logged an amazing 1,122 landings. That averages out to 4.5 hours of flight time per day, 4+ landings per hour. This is essentially all seat of the pants, visual flight rules type flying, where the pilots maintain their spatial orientation by looking outside the aircraft primarily. The left side door gunner was also a Huey crew chief. He was responsible for the operation of for daily maintenance operations on the aircraft. Crew chiefs also had other duties, one of which was monitoring the amount of weight being placed on board when we were hauling cargo. And we could haul about a ton in addition to the crew and door guns and ammo and fuel. The typical aircraft load on a combat assault would be 7 infantry. 4 troopers sat on the bench seat to the back of the cargo area there facing forward, 1 on the jump seat behind the pilots facing aft, 1 on the floor on either side of the jump seat. There were more than 400 helicopters assigned to the division, so the outfit can move a large number of infantry in one lift if need be, and that happened on occasion. A much more typical airmobile assault involved moving a company of infantry, 100 to perhaps 125 troopers, using 5 slicks like this one, escorted by 2 gunships. Next. This is a Huey Cobra. 2 pilots, or 2 crew members, both pilots. The aircraft commander sat in the rear seat. He would fly the Cobra on a gun run. He would aim the entire aircraft in order to fire the fixed ordnance on the wings. This Cobra is armed with 4 rocket pods, each with 7 rockets. These rockets had 10-pound high explosive warheads They functioned about like a mortar round when they struck the ground. The front seat pilot was the co-pilot gunner. He operated minigun in the nose turret. Minigun is a 6-barreled 30 caliber machine gun, often set to fire 2,000 rounds per minute. Next. Frontal view of a Cobra, the fuselage being 3 feet wide. Next. Quick look at other helicopters used by the division. This is an OH-6A Cayuse, referred to as a Loach, used for observation purposes. It was also flown low and slow by some of the first Cav scout crews. Next. CH-47 Chinook, seldom used on assaults, often used to transport personnel and cargo from one secure area to another, used to recover downed Hueys, used to transport by sling load 105 millimeter howitzers to new artillery fire bases in the field when the division was getting ready to operate in an area beyond present 1st Cav artillery coverage. Next. This is a CH-54 Sky Crane. This helicopter could lift 20,000 pounds in a sling load. That was a big deal 50 years ago. 20,000 pounds represents about 4 times the typical bomb load of a World War II B-17. Used to recover downed Chinooks, might be used to sling load a backhoe to a hilltop in the boonies in order to construct a new firebase, might resupply that firebase with 8 or 9 tons of 105 ammo. Next. I'm a small person, but that's a large helicopter, no matter how you cut it. Next. Getting to 1st Cavalry Division airmobile operations and air assault tactics. This is the A Company operations bunker at Landing Zone English in the fall of 1967. Next. Inside operations, the chart at the top of this photo indicates the maintenance status for about half the A Company Hueys. The company call sign when I took this photo was Serpent. A Company flight crews are most interested in the daily mission assignment sheet at the bottom of the photo. Next. We skipped the photo. Next. Uh-oh. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to discuss the various missions that were on the daily mission assignment sheet. What we're going to do here is talk about the tactics that were used on a full prep combat assault. That would be an assault where the landing zone was struck with 1st Cav artillery before the slicks brought the first lift of infantry into the landing zone. Now, we used a trail formation going into pickup zones on assaults and into landing zones on extractions. This photo actually involves an extraction. It's my favorite photo, by the way. I took the photo and I'll explain an extraction shortly. Pilots maintained a trail formation by lining up the tail rotor gearbox with the exhaust of the Huey they were flying formation on. We would carry the trail formation right to touchdown in the landing area, set down one behind the other. That caused the infantry to approach our helicopters from the side at about a 90-degree angle, thus greatly reducing the likelihood that one of the troopers would walk into a tail rotor. I mentioned this photo involved an extraction. I took the photo from the cockpit of the number 2 Slick. The formation is on final approach to a landing zone obscured by the lead Huey. Based upon the apparent height of the vegetation, we might be 500 or 600 feet above the ground here. we are proceeding to move 1st Cav infantry already in the field, either somewhere else in the field if it's an ongoing operation, or much more likely, actually, we are returning the unit to their base camp. On a typical extraction, the landing zone itself would be considered secure because there were 1st Cav troopers there waiting for us to move them someplace. The area around the landing zone is not secure, which is why the door guns are up. Notice that the door guns on our slicks were mounted on a post rather than being handheld. The door gunner could swivel the weapon right or left or up or down, but the mount absorbed all the recoil. So the door gunners could fire a very long, very well-controlled string of shots with no problem. The general rule of engagement for our door gunners was they would not fire their weapon unless we were fired upon. The major exception to that was a full prep assault where the door gunners and the gunchips, one on each side of the formation, would shoot into the landing zone when the formation was on final approach with the first lift of infantry. In this case, the door gunners will be very closely watching the tree lines on either side of the approach. They're looking for people shooting at the formation. The background in this photo shows rice paddies in the coastal plain. In the distance is the coast of Vietnam and the South China Sea. Next. Getting back to our full prep assault, trail formation approach to the pickup zone. The foreground in this photo shows the A Company area at our base camp, pretty Spartan living. Next. A typical pickup zone might be located just outside the wire of the infantry unit's base camp. We would land in trail, 7 troopers board each Huey. Next. Departing the pickup zone, notice the infantry at 3 o'clock. So the first lift is going to bring 35 infantry, 1 platoon, into the landing zone. Their job 1 is to secure the LZ while we return to the same pickup zone, bring the rest of the company. A company of infantry might have 100 to 130 troops, but we will bring the rest of the company into the same landing zone using 2 or 3 additional lifts, depending on how up to full strength the company was. Next. 5 slicks escorted by 2 Cobra gunships heading out. Next. En route to the landing zone, the 5 slicks, the troop carrying aircraft, would get into a V formation. We would carry the V formation right into the landing zone. V formation provided the pilots with an unobstructed view of the landing zone on final approach. Also provided overlapping fields of fire for the door gunners. From the standpoint of the infantry, they wanted us to land as a group and as close together as possible, so they had the combat power of all 35 troopers as soon as they left the aircraft in the landing zone. I took this photo from the right door gun position of the number 3 Huey. Lead is at the point of the V. Number 2 is to the right, is to lead's right. Number 3 to lead's left. Number 4 to lead's far right. Number 5 to lead's far left. The out of focus item at the left corner is an out of focus door gun. I flew as a door gunner every once in a while for the pure heck of it. I can tell you for certain that there was no way I would do that at the present time. Perhaps many of us can remember some of the screwy things we did in our early 20s for the heck of it. This was one of them for me. The background in this photo is back in the hills to the west of the coastal plain. This area has been pounded with heavy ordnance. The large craters on the right result from bombs dropped by fixed-wing aircraft. The smaller craters in the center and the left are probably from artillery rounds. The string of bomb craters on the right probably resulted from a B-52 strike, arc light strike. Next. A view of lead from the left seat of number 2. Pilots maintained a V formation or an echelon formation by lining up the navigation light over the door gunner's head with the blade antenna between the pilots. There is less separation here between aircraft than there will be on final approach to the landing zone. This is more flyby type separation when we were showing off our ability to fly formation. More about that later. The canvas bag on the door gun caught fired cases, so we didn't have to worry about a blade strike with an empty case. Next. A view of number 4 from the right door gunner position in number 2 with the coastal plain and the coast of Vietnam in the background. Next. I took this photo through the sights of a door gun. Notice that the door gunners had the best view of the countryside. Next. This is the same photo with the focus moved back to the rear sight on the door gun. Notice the orange tips on the bullets in the ammunition belt loaded into the weapon. The door guns on our slicks were loaded with solid tracer ammunition rather than a typical machine gun belt, which had 1 out of 5 rounds as a tracer. Tracer bullets have pyrotechnic material in their base that is ignited when the round is fired, burns all the way from the muzzle to where the bullet strikes the target, thus allowing a machine gunner to visually follow the path of that bullet. The tactical reason for loading our door guns with solid tracer was the sights on the weapon were not usable when we were moving forward at 50 or 60 knots on final to the landing zone, and the door gunner was engaging a target off to the side, down, and forward. So in that case, the weapon was operated like a garden hose. The door gunner would focus on the particular spot on the ground he wanted to engage. He would shoot at it and then direct the stream of tracer bullets into the target area. Very effective way to operate the weapon. Next. Here we have a view from the cockpit on final approach to a full prep landing zone. While the formation is en route to the landing zone, 1st Cav Artillery would be shooting into the landing zone area for 2 reasons. The obvious one being the potential for the enemy to be present. We were also concerned about booby traps, particularly back in the hills where most of these full prep assaults took place. Artillery into the landing zone would hopefully set off any booby traps present. The last round fired by a tube artillery would be white phosphorus. The artillery prep was timed so that the white phosphorus round arrived in the landing zone when the formation was 1 minute out. We obviously did not want to land until we knew the artillery prep was over. White smoke in the landing zone informed the flight leader that the artillery tubes were clear. Next. Here we're short final to a different landing zone. This is actually a more typical landing zone for a full prep assault. It's back in the hills someplace. A little bit more separation between the aircraft, but notice that the navigation light is still lined up with the blade antenna. The smoke in the background marks the location of the LZ. It's what remains from the artillery prep. Next. Okay, this is the same LZ seconds before the formation lands. This is a view of the number 3 slick across the formation from the left seat of number 2. Notice that the door gunner is firing his weapon. The troopers in the cargo compartment have their fingers in their ear because of the noise. Understand the trust placed in the ability and the judgment of that door gunner. There are 2 slicks and 22 guys downrange from that weapon. He is shooting behind the lead aircraft and in front of number 2. At this point in the assault, the 2 gunships would be behind the VF-5, 1 on each side. They're firing also. And actually, if we look at the top of this photo, top area of it, about 1/4 of the way in from the right side, you will see a red streak. That's a tracer bullet. It was fired by the left side gunship supporting the assault. He's shooting into the area the formation will overfly as we depart the landing zone. We spent very little time actually on the ground in the LZ, 15 seconds or less, usually quite a bit less. The infantry would bail out. We would depart, return to the pickup zone, and bring the rest of the company into the same landing zone. So that's a full prep assault as practiced by the 1st Cavalry Division. A regular assault happened in the same manner, minus the artillery prep and minus the door gunners and the gunships firing, unless we were fired upon. Next. After completing the assault, we would return to our base camp in formation, give the new guide pilots an opportunity to practice formation flying in a less stressful situation. Sometimes the flight leader would call A Company operations and announce that the flight would be doing a low-level flyby of the A Company area. Everybody would beat feet outside and ooh and ah as the formation went by. That's what's happening here with this just about perfect VF-5. Evident in this photo are high morale, strong unit of esprit de corps. We were flat proud of our ability to fly formation. Next. A right echelon formation on downwind to the company area. These 5 slicks will fly past operations, peel off to the left, 1 by 1, make a 180-degree turn, come back into the company area to land in the revetments for the aircraft. Next. 2 finger 4 formations approaching operations. On the ground are the revetments we parked our Hueys in. They were meant to protect the aircraft from enemy rocket and mortar attacks. We'll see later they weren't always 100% effective in that regard. Next. We can tell that the right seat pilot is flying the Huey to our right of lead. And the reason for that is the aircraft commander is waving at the company area. I always thought that was pretty funny. Next. Next. Okay, this mission I'm going to describe now is the logistics mission. This is probably the mission type where we logged most of our flight time. It was no big deal to fly 5 to 7 hours of, or log 5 to 7 hours of flight time, 30 to 50 landings during the course of a day flying logistics. You would begin by flying to the logistics pad of the infantry unit we're supporting, usually a battalion. You'd receive coordinates for their landing zones in the field. There might be 2 or 3 of them. Sometimes the location of those landing zones changed as the infantry did its thing during the day. You would spend the day flying back and forth from the logistics pad to the field unit, hauling them whatever they needed to continue their field operation. Food, water, ammo, equipment, replacements, maybe hot chow for their last meal of the day. Next. One of the cool things about flying logistics is you had an opportunity to sightsee. Vietnam is a beautiful place. The road in this photo is Route 1. It's the major north-south highway in Vietnam. There's a Vietnamese hamlet astride the road, probably farming the rice paddies. The small hills in the photo are foothills to the upland area to the west of the coastal plain. Next. We would sometimes visit artillery Firebase. It was often an infantry unit responsible for security of the Firebase, which we would support. The artillery battery would have separate 1st Cav helicopter support. Next. This photo has a slick-on short final to a single ship landing zone that has been chopped out of the jungle. The white items in the landing zone are the stumps of trees that were cut down to form the landing zone. It looks like there's 3 troopers interested in a ride back to their base camp. We might have three replacements on board. I took this photo, by the way, from the right door gun position. The soldier to the right edge of the landing zone with his hand up to his ear is probably talking to the pilots on his backpack FM radio. That's the communication means we used with the field. Next. Most of our flight time involved combat assaults or extractions or flying logistics. We did fly other mission types on a less frequent basis. I'm going to spend time talking about this emergency resupply mission because it's an excellent example of the cooperation and trust that existed between 1st Cav aviation units and our infantry. This was likely the most dangerous flying we did, hence the gallows humor in this poster someone tacked up in operations. The pucker factor here was partially related to the potential for being shot at, but probably even more concerned the difficulty associated with flying at night using visual flight rules in other than quite decent weather. There were no lights on the ground once you left the base camp area. Remember, this is before night vision goggles. On a night with a solid overcast, it became difficult to see the ground. It became difficult to see the horizon, and therefore easy to get into a condition called pilot vertigo or spatial disorientation, where the pilot flying loses the correct perception of up and down. That could happen to a pilot no matter what their skill level. It could happen to a pilot without the pilot even realizing it was happening. You would soon lose control of the aircraft. So the infantry knew it could be difficult to fly at night. They knew we would be making a lights out approach to the landing zone. They also knew that barring really lousy weather, we would come if they asked for our help. We knew the infantry would not ask us to fly at night unless there really was an emergency involved. It's called a tactical emergency. So if you were activated for an emergency resupply and there would be a crew and an aircraft on call, it typically meant there was a 1st Cav field unit that was either in contact with the enemy or had recently been in contact with the enemy. The ground commander decided he wanted to be resupplied with ammunition before daylight. You would begin by flying to the infantry unit's logistics pad. You'd take on a load of ammo. You'd receive coordinates for the landing zone, and you would head out. Finding the landing zone usually wasn't a big deal because we had an FM homing device in the aircraft that gave us a course indication whenever the ground unit transmitted on their backpack radio. En route, you would talk to the guys on the ground. They would tell you about the landing zone, how large it was, where the obstructions were. They would tell you what the situation was with the enemy. They would often, or sometimes at least, recommend an approach direction based on all those factors. You could absolutely trust what you were being told. When you arrived at the landing zone, you would shoot the approach to a trooper standing in the LZ who had a flashlight with a red lens. And they became quite adept at shining that flashlight up the glide slope you would use for the approach. Lights out approach, no matter how dark it was. The reason for that being we knew the enemy was in the area. Turning your landing light on when you were low and slow was not a good thing to do. We also typically did not fire door guns, even if fired upon. One reason being the first cav guys on the ground and concern about a friendly fire accident. Also, our door guns were loaded with solid tracer. And tracers, of course, work both ways. So if you're going to turn on your landing light, or if you're going to fire the door guns, you might as well turn on the landing light so you could see what you were doing. Once you're on the ground, you'd unload the ammo. The ammo would be unloaded. This was the mission type where we were probably most likely to make a medevac. Most of the medevacs were flown by air ambulance Hueys. They were part of a medical evacuation unit. They were unarmed rather than having door gunners in the back. There was a combat medic and a crew chief. The combat medic had the drugs and the equipment and the training necessary to take care of the wounds. In this case, we were already there, so particularly if there were lightly wounded involved, we would sometimes haul ammunition out and make a medevac on the way back. We also sometimes hauled ammunition out and brought killed in action troopers back to their base camp. That makes for a very sad ride back. Next. We did take hits on occasion. There's a hit here above the tail number that the bullet came through the tail rotor disc and hit the tail rotor pylon on the tail boom. Next. Hitting the tail boom. Next. There's a couple hits here in the synchronized elevator on the tail boom. I took this photo from underneath the synchronized elevator along the path of the bullet with the sky as a background. Next. Hits in the engine area. Next. That's a very close miss for a door gunner. Next. That one would definitely wake up the pilots. Next. These are weapons captured at the Battle of Tam Quan, T-A-M-Q-U-A-N. If you Google Tam Quan, you'll find that it took place over a 2-week period in December 1967, quite close to LZ English. All the fighting here took place about 6 miles from our base camp. Tam Quan is an excellent example of the way the air mobility concept inherent to the 1st Cavalry Division was meant to function. It began when a 1st Cav scout crew noticed a radio antenna in a tree in the coastal plain. Think about how low and slow that scout crew had to be to even see a radio antenna. The antenna was investigated by the small infantry component of that air cavalry troop, 1 platoon, perhaps 30, 35 troopers. They encountered heavy contact, backed off. A company of regular 1st Cav infantry was air assaulted into the area, more heavy contact. The fighting quickly expanded to include the 4 1st Cav battalions on the poster there. There were also some ARVN troops involved. The enemy unit was the 22nd NVA Regiment, part of their 3rd Division, likely in place or getting in place for whatever their assignment was for 68 Tet, a major enemy offensive that took place about 6 weeks later. Extensive use of assault helicopters during Tam Quan. Again, using my flight records as an example, I logged 54.6 hours of combat flight time during this 2-week period. And of course, the other flight personnel in my company, door gunners and crew chiefs, as well as pilots, would have flown the similar amount. When contact was broken, U.S. casualties amounted to 50 killed in action, 58 killed in action, 250 wounded. The enemy loss was put at over 600 killed in action. Next. So recoilless rifle captured during Tam Quan. Belonged to the 135th Recoilless Rifle Company of the 22nd NBA Regiment. There's battle damage on the lower left. Next. This is the map I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and this image was meant for a much larger screen, but we'll make do with what's here. The mouth of the river we viewed in the photograph is along the shoreline, of course, just below the center horizontal crease in the map. LZ English was located due west of there along the major north-south road. That's Route 1. And the Battle of Tam Quan took place to the east of LZ English and then northeast of LZ English. Next. So our enemy POWs we hauled back from the field. Like us, these are young people. Next. Here we have one of our more sophisticated warrant officer pilots. He's hamming it up when we learned that our company, along with about 2/3 of the rest of the 1st Cavalry Division, would be moving north 200 miles to a new base camp just south of the DMZ. This move took place shortly before 68 Tet. That structure in the background, by the way, with the pink tank on top is our shower. Again, this is Spartan living. Next. One of the cool things about serving as a warrant officer pilot is the flying was your major duty responsibility. Some of us had secondary duties that took up a small amount of our time. About the last third of my tour, I served as the A Company's assistant operations officer. My assignment during this move north amounted to accompanying some of our vehicles, a few Jeeps, a few 3/4-ton trucks that were assigned to our company on the move north. So we boarded Air Force cargo planes at Landing Zone English. The Air Force flew us to a base camp called Phu Bai, about 7 miles south of the city of Hue, where we deplaned, got on Route 1, and then rode Route 1 north through Hue to our new base camp. I took this photo along the way. It's another example of the beauty of South Vietnam. It's kind of hard to believe there's a war going on here, but there was. Next. This bunker is on the south abutment of the Highway 1 bridge over the Perfume River, which flows through the city of Hue. U.S. Marines from Phu Bai attacked across this bridge during the Battle of Hue, perhaps a week and a half after this photo was taken. Next. Buddhist temple in Hue. Next. Government building in Hue. This is actually the University of Hue. Next. This is our new base camp, place called Camp Evans. It was about 25 miles south of the DMZ. The aircraft in the center there is a side view of a Huey Cobra gunship. The aircraft to the left of that, along the close to the Jeep, is a C model Huey gunship. It's similar to the helicopter hanging from the ceiling in the Veterans Museum. Next. One of the things you want to do soon after you arrive in a new area is try to fix yourself up a relatively safe place to sleep. Next. There's a real good friend and fellow volunteer here at the Veterans Museum that likes to tell me this is one of my more flattering photographs. What we're doing here is filling sandbags. The sandbags were used to build walls around our tents and revetments for our Hueys. Next. This is why. Next. Enemy mortar round impacted in front of one of our slicks. This happened shortly after 68 Tet. Next. It's again one of our tents in the new area, Spartan Living. This tent has actually had a do-it-yourself home improvement project in the form of a wood floor. The wood for that flooring comes from the boxes that 105 millimeter artillery rounds are shipped in. They're shipped 2 to a box. You would scrounge the boxes from your local artillery battery, take them apart, then use the wood to build things, floors, or a bookcase, or maybe a desk. Next. This is my tent at the new area. I slept in the bunker off the back of the tent. I could take a direct hit on that bunker with a mortar round, and it might wake me up, but that would be about it. Next. This is sunset in Vietnam towards the end of my tour. Next. If you're getting ready to go for a Huey ride and you walk up to the aircraft and you see that sitting in the front seat, I would strongly suggest you consider doing something else that day. That completes the presentation. I guess we're going to try to answer questions.
Absolutely, Rick. That was a fantastic presentation to see just an inside view of what your life was like over there. And we do have plenty of questions that have come in during the presentation. And we're going to start off with the first one. Comes from Neil. And Neil would like you to say something about how you could fly the formations through hostile areas to minimize the risk of ground fire. He says those V formations look like real big targets. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I sure can. That V formation, you have to realize that these tactics we use for the airmobile assaults work pretty well when your opponents were light infantry armed with 30 caliber weapons. Once you start talking about larger weapons, 50 caliber or anti-aircraft artillery, not so much. So the V formation was for 2 purposes. One, it was kind of like a box formation from World War II bombers, where there were many machine guns could fire at the same time. And actually, if we were on short final to a landing zone and all of our door guns were working, as well as the gunships, there was something like 10,000 rounds per minute coming out of the formation. So it would keep people's heads down. But primarily the infantry wanted us to land as a group. So and close together. So when they bailed out of the aircraft, the ground commander there would have the combat power of his entire unit ready for him.
The next question, Rick. Somebody wants to know why. What was the fighting ability of ARVN? Was it as bad as they had thought, or was it as bad as it had been presented?
The answer to that, from my experience, is yes. One of the major advantages of flying for the 1st Cavalry Division is that the soldiers we were moving around were 1st Cav soldiers. If somebody told you something from the ground, you could believe what they were saying. I don't know a heck of a lot about the way the ARVNs flew their helicopters because we simply weren't involved with them. It was all a first cav operation.
So they definitely did have helicopters then.
Oh, they did. Yeah, they certainly did. As a matter of fact, when we left many of them there.
And what was, you left the helicopters there, but what was done with the captured weapons, Rick?
I don't really know for sure what happened to the weapons. I mean, I took that photo with all those weapons. By the way, those weapons are not the sort of weapons you would expect to be used by Viet Cong or insurgents. That was a regular North Vietnamese Army unit.
The next question talks a little bit about the armor on board the helicopters, and of course, due to weight concerns, the armor was probably minimized. What did the crew do to, minimize the impact of maybe rounds coming up from the ground? I mean, was it true that we see in all the movies where the infantry soldiers sit on their helmets?
Well, the pilots were better off. We sat in an armored seat. So in addition to the chicken plate, the chest protector, which would stop a 30 caliber bullet, we sat in an armored seat. The crew chief and the door gunner typically would only have the chicken plate. A lot of them scrounged up a second chicken plate and they would sit on it. But as far as the infantry and so forth, there wasn't anything done that I'm aware of.
But Rick, if you could just talk briefly, why warrant officers as helicopter pilots? Why not regular officers or maybe even senior enlisted?
Well, you have to understand what a warrant officer is. In the normal United States Army, warrant officers were very experienced NCOs. Now, a warrant officer is supposed to have a specific job responsibility and to become very expert in what that happens to be. With us, it was flying a helicopter. With other warrant officers, it might be administration, it might be criminal investigation or whatever, but they had a specific job and they became very expert at it. Whereas the commissioned officers were more general sort of individuals and got involved in commanding a unit and so forth. You were expected to learn how to fly a helicopter very well. And even now, most of the Army aviators are warrant officers. And if you want to find the best helicopter pilot you can in the Army, you would find a Warrant Officer 3 or a Warrant Officer 4 that's been flying helicopters his entire period in the Army.
I actually considered submitting my application to Warrant Officer School just for that exact job, but I was afraid of flying at the time, so I decided against that. Probably a good choice on my part. Rick, if you could talk about the logistical concerns about keeping the choppers fueled.
Okay, let me wait till I didn't really understand the question. Oh wait, it's coming up now.
There you go.
When we went out on a mission, the last thing we would do was refuel the helicopter. That was that's why the major landing zones were right along Route 1, because fuel would be brought in. We would refuel the helicopters from bladders. And you could fly the helicopter about 2 hours or so, then you would have to refuel. We always parked them with a full tank of gas.
I don't know if maybe this is a question you might not want to answer, depending on how you feel about this sort of thing. But the question was asked: what was your most fearful mission or event, or the scariest part of your tour?
Okay, let me see if that will come up so I can understand it.
Sure.
I would say no. About the only relationship I've ever had in civilian life that compares to the relationship I had with my comrades in Vietnam is the relationship I have with my wife. And you'll hear about people talking about going to reunions and seeing their buddies after 50 years, and it's like they haven't been gone for half an hour or so. That's all true. And I learned a whole bunch about leadership by watching our company commander, a guy by the name of Major Byer. We have kept in touch ever since. Outstanding leader. He would ask us to do nothing he wouldn't do himself. And as a matter of fact, if I ever got into a situation in civilian life where I was starting to get really nervous about doing something, what I would try to think of is what happened in Vietnam. Okay, how do we operate in and out of a hot LZ? Just the way we did in and out of a regular LZ. And I would also comment that there were not as many hot LZs as one would think by reading the popular literature about Vietnam. The tactics we used with the artillery prep and so forth, it's really very seldom that the LZ was hot, although I remember bullets coming through the windshield, so some of them were. And we simply didn't change our operation at all. I mean, you brought the troopers into the LZ, they got out of the aircraft just as quick as they possibly could, because if there were enemy around, they'd be shooting at the helicopters, and we beat feet from the landing zone just as quickly as we possibly could. I don't know that there was a serious interaction between the Army and the Air Force. There certainly wasn't at our level, because the only interaction we had with the Air Force would be when we were sent to a place like Da Nang from our base camp at LZ English, where when somebody thought LZ English was going to get mortared, so we fly to Da Nang and we'd remain overnight there. That was actually a good deal because we actually got to go to an officers club for a change. But I never experienced any tension between the Army and the Air Force. We just didn't interact with the Air Force. I don't know about fear. One of the things that happens here is that you're so concentrated on doing your job correctly and not making a mistake that gets one of your buddies hurt, that you simply don't have time. I do remember two approaches that I made. Both happened to be on emergency resupplies at night. One of which was my fault. I simply made a poor approach. I was going way too fast at the bottom of the approach. And that's not all that difficult to do because your depth perception is screwed up when it's dark out. So I got to the bottom of the approach flying the aircraft, and I would either have to make a huge flare, which was very dangerous. And actually what you would normally do is you'd make a missed approach, go out, fly around and land again. But you simply didn't want to do that on an emergency resupply. You wanted to land exactly once. So what I did was made a low level 360 around the landing zone and then went back in. I suspect that increased the pucker factor for the other three guys on the aircraft. I think there were some operations from the Huey with special forces. We never got involved in that though. So there was no one jumped out of our aircraft with a parachute. Should I be reading these questions so everybody knows what they are?
They're coming up on the screen, Rick, just that everybody can see them just as you can. So I think we're okay, but I can read them out loud as we go along. Mike, if you want to put the next one up. As a kid, I heard a lot about the Mekong Delta. Did you have any assignments in that area?
I did not. We spent all our time in the Central Highlands and up near the DMZ. I never got farther south than about halfway down the country. I can see my brother waving at me. See Jim Kurtz too. Hi, Jim.
The next question, Rick, did you fly your quote unquote own helicopter every day, or was it just kind of like whatever aircraft was available, that's what you picked up?
Well, that's a great question. The helicopters were actually owned by the crew chief. So the helicopters were assigned to a crew chief. You would learn what aircraft you were flying and who you were flying with as the aircraft commander or the pilot, whatever it happened to be, when you went into the operations bunker and looked at the mission assignment sheet. So we flew different aircraft almost every day. We also flew with different aircraft commanders when we first arrived in Vietnam. And that's actually a good thing because each aircraft commander would be essentially serving as an instructor pilot for the new guys, and you'd fly with different people and learned rather quickly. But the helicopters belonged to the crew chief. The gunner was sometimes a person that was trained as a crew chief and was waiting for one of the crew chiefs to rotate home so he could obtain his own aircraft. Some of the gunners were also infantry. Some of them wanted to fly. They would re-up for 6 months or so because they wanted to fly as a door gunner. Other guys, it's my understanding that if you arrived back in country and you had less than 2 months or 3 months, you could get out right away. So some of the infantry would fly as a door gunner for that 2 or 3 months period so they could leave the Army as soon as we got home. And actually, door gunners being infantry was good because they would advocate for the guys on the ground.
All right, Rick, the next question, there have been quite a few movies, books, etc., claiming to depict air cavalry operations in Vietnam. Is there any that you would suggest that, were more accurate than others? And is there any that were just completely, giving out a false sense of what it was like over there?
I have gone to a few of those movies. The only one I actually attended where we were soldiers. And the reason for that is that the assault helicopter company involved in that movie was my company. They made that assault like a year and a half before I arrived there, and I was interested in seeing how well they were depicting the use of the helicopters. And actually, it wasn't too bad. It was fairly close. The majority of the movies, I think, are Hollywood over-exaggerated.
All right, Rick. Well, we definitely appreciate your time today. We got a lot of comments on the chat board about how fantastic that presentation was. And I certainly thought so as well. I've been able to work with you for the past few weeks and see a lot of those images and ask you a lot of questions about it. But just to hear the whole thing all together and seeing, what your daily life was like out there, it's just amazing. And yeah, it's simply amazing.
One comment I would like to make is I want everybody to understand that I was one of 40,000 pilots. I don't know how many crew chiefs and gunners were involved, but similar sort of number at least. We've had an all volunteer armed forces now for 2 generations. Many of our citizens don't understand what we ask young people to do when we send them off to war. It's one of the reasons I do this presentation.
Well, Rick, we're glad you do. And we are certainly privileged to hear you talk today. And we're actually really glad that we could finally get this presentation going with the last 2 false starts that we've had. But we would like to thank Mr. Rick Berry for his time today. and for his information and for sharing his photographs with us too. Those are very personal things that our soldiers that return home from combat zones hold dear, and to be able to share those with the community and with the crowd, that just gives it more meaning and even lends itself to more reflection as well, moving forward with the modern military. So Rick, thank you so much for your presentation today and for your time and for all your information. And I would like to thank everybody else as well for showing up for our Curator conversations today. We appreciate you joining us in the afternoon, and we hope everybody has a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week.